What is going on, y'all? I'm KMBest. Let's check out this week's top decks in Marvel Snap. First up is Lockjaw with High Evolutionary. I view this list not necessarily as foundational to the metagame, but as a very important list because it is one of very few lists that is a genuinely good matchup into the High Evolutionary Lockdown decks. And it's also one of very few lists that can just high roll its way out of bad situations. People often propose like just play rock slide decks against them, but it's not actually that good. They can still high roll even if you disrupt their Lockjaw. The fundamental thing this deck does is just put a ton of points onto the board. And it is generally, in my opinion, just like a very safe pick into an open field. There's going to be a lot of easy wins for you if you just play this. It's a high power ceiling. We have the Killmonger in there to make sure that we beat the High Evolutionary Lockdown decks. Killing their one-cost cards is usually very, very powerful. It has some occasional other uses. If a bounce player doesn't protect their kitty, for example, the Killmonger can snipe it. Other cards I have seen in that slot include Wave, much better in the face of Kitty Pride, which is one of your few bad matchups. Still does nothing against Galactus, which is your other really bad matchup. And another thing I've seen is Iceman. Iceman can be very good in the mirror if that's what you're interested in hitting. It's not going to swing a Galactus matchup, especially in battle mode, but maybe you can make your matchup not as terrible as you would think if you just like hit an Electro or something and you can like drop a Hulk and maybe figure it out. It's not going to be great, and it never will be great, but the prevalence of this deck, the fact that it's a safe pick, is usually what boosts it here. In the most recent Snap Battle Arena, I believe there were 3 versions of this deck that all made the top 8. Of course, when they made the top 8, they ran into those bad matchups, and you can't escape them there. So they did not make it that far, but 3 of them made it to the top 8. Shows the power of this deck in an open field. Now, I mentioned High Evolutionary Control already, and it makes sense to segue from the previous list into High Evolutionary Control because this is sort of the underlying foundational thing in the metagame. Before the Spiderman nerf, Glenn Jones confirmed that it was like the highest play rate, the highest win rate, and either the highest or second highest cube rate over the last few weeks. So if you have been paying attention to these tier lists, if you've been listening to my deck recommendations, you would have been very far ahead of the curve. You would have been playing the best deck in the game. I no longer think it is like a lock for best deck in the game. It is just quite solid, and I've opted for the Spider-Man here with the expectation that I'll run into less move stuff. However, the addition of move and the greater adaptation of High Evolutionary Lockjaw has led to this deck going from having very few bad matchups to actually having a couple real ones. One of the major advantages this deck has, though, is that it is very, very good into Galactus, and there's going to be plenty of people playing Galactus, and sort of the metagame triangle here is you have these decks like High Evolutionary Lockjaw that just lose to Galactus, and you have this deck in Evo Control that just beats Galactus, and then the Evolutionary Lockjaw decks force people off of the Evolutionary Lockdown decks, which leaves them vulnerable to Galactus. This is the kind of thing, when this was a big thing, it was protecting the Lockjaw decks from Galactus. Now, after the nerf, it's doing a lot less of that protection, and you can sort of actually play this and expect to beat Galactus. So if you're looking for a deck that has a good matchup into Galactus, stopping them from playing where they want to play, or just Spider-Manning where they play Galactus because you can limit them to only really being able to play it in one spot, great way to beat that. Big, big draw of this deck for me is that it is just genuinely really good into Galactus. So we've talked a lot about Galactus. Here's Galactus, and you know, God willing, this deck won't exist in a couple more days, or at least it'll be harder to make work, because I know Second Dinner has mentioned that they view Galactus as a little bit above where they want him to be. I do think that's the kind of problem you can only solve in a patch rather than in an OTA. You have to fundamentally change the card a little bit. And I hope that whatever they do to change the card, well, first of all, I guess I hope they change the card in this upcoming patch on Tuesday, and that whatever they do to change the card will be something significant in terms of making a deck like this a lot more risky. Because right now, the way Galactus works is you identify if a bunch of people are going to be vulnerable to Galactus, and then you play Galactus. There's not really a lot more than that. It's very binary. Do you think a bunch of people are no longer playing High Evolutionary Lockdown because they got their Spider-Man nerfed? Okay, time to whip out the Galactus. And I know people in the comments are going to say, okay, well, it's not that simple. Here's the thing. It actually is that simple. This list that you're looking at was played by Braude to first place in the most recent Snap Battle Arena, and I helped him build it with the explicit logic that everyone was just going to be cold to Galactus because they were playing like high Evo Lockdown or like wave, or high Evo Lockjaw or like wave mid-range piles. And that's exactly what ended up happening. The finals ended up being a Galactus mirror. This is not to say Galactus is overpowered, but what it does do is it creates a situation where you have to be prepared for it, and if you're not prepared for it, you're dead to it. And that is a big cost to pay in a card game where you have only 12 cards. Not a lot of decks can afford to dedicate space to Galactus. And that is why Galactus was a good choice here. It's not always going to be a good choice. You have to make a conscious read that, hey, not a lot of people are actually playing the answers here. I'm not seeing a lot of Storm Spider-Man. I'm not seeing a lot of Debris. And those are like the real things you're afraid of. There are other cards that can move the matchup a little bit closer, right? Like Cosmo's a card that can stop you if they get it on the right spot. Polaris is a card that can stop you if they get it on the right spot. But really, it's like Debris, Storm Spider-Man, Arrow. Those are the things that are actually spooky to see as a Galactus player. Those are the things that you're going to have to adjust your play style to fit. For example, if you know they have Arrow, fill up your lane before playing Galactus so they can't pull it over with the Arrow. Stuff like that. If you know they have Polaris, what you want to do is you go for Electro and don't play any of the early game. All that stuff is stuff that you have to think about when playing Galactus, but fundamentally, what this list does is strip the game down to its bare essentials, ask if you have a counter, and beat you if you don't. Speaking of decks that ask if you have a counter and then beat you if you don't, I have been loving this deck post-nerf. Even if there are still so many waves in the open metagame, one thing that I've noticed about people who play the decks that this deck is scared of, which is to say Storm Spider-Man decks or wave decks, is that they tend to snap on having those counters, and that is a tell to you that you need to start playing your stuff earlier, right? So, for example, I win some games when like someone snaps, I'm like, oh, that's a wave, so I play around the wave by playing all my stuff on turn 5, play a Chavez on turn 6, that's actually fine. One of the things that you'll notice is that a lot of your losses are going to be 1 cube, a lot of your wins are going to be more than that, because the things that beat you are so clearly defined. So very obvious. When your opponent is snapping them as if you don't know what they're doing, then you will end up picking up some wins off of that. Wave is not an auto win. An unexpected wave is an auto win. An auto win is much rarer than you think if you always play with those cards in mind. I'm not saying you always play on turn 5, but if it's turn 5 and your opponent is playing like a Darkhawk mid-range deck and they snap, and there's no real good reason to do that while you're looking at the board, then you can reasonably expect a wave to come down, and you should. And that is important to understand about playing this deck. You need to be looking for the cards that hard counter you. It's like a different version of Galactus. And right now, I'm not sure if it's a little bit worse, per se, but it does have the same sort of dynamic. You go over the top of the High Evolutionary Lockjaw deck, and then you get like a little bit countered by people like preventing you from playing places or playing wave or whatever. And generally, those two things are a little more common than people preventing you from playing places and playing Debris. So like wave being a lot more common than Debris or whatever means that Galactus is often a better choice, if a little bit more linear and a lot less fun to play. Now, the snap dynamics of this deck are a little bit better than Galactus, honestly. But they are remarkably similar decks in the context that they just ask a question and can you answer the question? And if you can't answer the question, they will just win the game. So this is my build of Move, and I have found it to be remarkably competitive, but I feel like it's on this list because it can very often take games down to a read. And what I mean by that is you are almost always able to get games winnable. You are going to be able to win every game, but winning those games requires that you understand what your opponent is doing, understand what they are thinking, and then make a play that beats what they are thinking. And move makes you do this more than anything. And so when you play move, I do want to be clear about this. There are not a lot of free wins. And if you guess wrong on some of those final turns, you will lose a lot of cubes. And I do think this deck, when played properly, when you're making your reads correctly, is one of the strongest things you can be doing in the game. Like, it genuinely does do incredibly powerful stuff, but so much of the power of it is predicated on you being able to say, all right, they're expecting a Heimdall, and they will play to beat the Heimdall. So here is my play that beats the play that beats the Heimdall. And if you are not correct in those reads, if they're not expecting a Heimdall, or if they're reading that you're not going to play the Heimdall, if you're wrong, you're going to lose games. And if you're right, you're going to win and feel like the smartest person in the entire world. Finally, I recently posted a video on this list, and it's still good. Like, I feel like I'm a few cards off. I really want to fit Luke Cage and Hazmat in here. I want to try to fit Scorpion in here. I want to try to fit Dr. Doom in here. There's so much tweaking that has to be done, but I really think this list sort of represents a step forward for the good cards archetype. Another member of my little Illuminati testing group, KJB, took this list. He changed, I believe, 2 cards. He ran Scorpion over Zabu, and he ran Dr. Doom over Rogue, and top 8 of the battle arena. Unfortunately, he ran into Galactus in the top 8 and absolutely lost, because you are absolutely dead to Galactus when you play this list, unless you can sneak a null Rogue play. Now, what this deck does fundamentally is just play some good cards and then have answers to everything. For the Lockjaw decks, you have Shang-Chi. For the Kitty Pryde decks, you have Wave. And you have like all of these little things that are just a little bit stronger than they should be for their energy cost. You obviously have the Hulk. You can do Wave and Abomination if you can pull it off. And I think for me, the flex spots are Zabu, The Thing, and Wave. One of the configurations I was thinking about was like, okay, what if we played, instead of Zabu and The Thing, we could play Hazmat and Luke Cage. Rogue, I believe, is less of a flex slot than you think, because so much of the strong stuff right now is high evolutionary. I still want to have an answer to opposing Luke Cages. So I think Rogue is like a lot less of a flex slot than she may seem to be, but she could be a flex slot. Wave being a flex slot is like, it's pretty much just, it beats Kitty. It's good against the discard when they do their swarm stuff. But if you're not worried about that, you can put other cards in there if you'd like. Like, this is a very customizable deck. The core is that we are just playing a bunch of tech cards with a bunch of undercosted threats. It's basically the same thought process as every Darkhawk deck. Cheap cards that put a lot of points on the board, along with tech answers to a lot of common problems. That is going to be it for me for this edition of the tier list. Is there anything you think that I missed? Is there anything you think that I really nailed? I know that I've been kind of on top of it recently in terms of recommending like high Evo Lockdown, high Evo Lockjaw pretty consistently through this. So I'm pretty happy with the most recent results from these tier lists. What do you think is going to happen on Tuesday? I think is actually the bigger question, right? Like, if they change Galactus, suddenly the metagame feels like it'll open up a lot more. If Galactus is no longer around, even if they just like disable him like they did Kitty Pryde, like anything that makes that deck less prevalent will do a lot to create more space for people to play around in. So I'm hoping they do that on Tuesday. I'm hoping it's something good. I would not want to be in their position. Everyone always proposes like these nerfs for Galactus that just like make it super clunky and awkward. And I feel like they don't want to do that, but also I don't have any better ideas. I'm not a game designer. So thank you for watching. I really appreciate it. Remember to leave a comment, like, and subscribe. Do those things that make the good brain chemicals go burr. And I will see you in the next one. As always, I've been KMBest. Have a good one.